A cold winter morning in Naples. The air smelled faintly of sea salt and cigarette smoke. The year was 1962, and an old man in an elegant brown coat stepped out of a taxi in front of the Hotel Excelsior. His name was Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the man who once ruled the American underworld like a king without a crown. His hair had thinned, his shoulders stooped, but his eyes still held the sharp, watchful gleam of a man who had seen everything, and trusted nothing. He walked slowly, carrying the weight of memory and secrets that no one else on earth could claim to know. In his coat pocket was a small packet of cigarettes and a folded letter. He had come here to meet someone, a producer who wanted to make a movie about his life. Luciano had agreed, but deep inside, he was uneasy. For a man like him, the past was not something to be filmed, it was something buried under blood, silence, and money. Yet there he was, on the edge of his final act, a legend reduced to a meeting in a hotel lobby. The marble floor gleamed beneath his shoes as he walked toward the lounge, where voices murmured softly over the clinking of glasses. The Italian sun filtered weakly through the glass doors, painting his face in pale gold. For a brief moment, the light seemed to mock him, the man who had once pulled the strings of America's underworld, now just another aging exile in a foreign land. He lit a cigarette, his hands trembling slightly. The first drag filled his lungs, and his thoughts drifted backward, to New York, to the streets of Harlem and Little Italy, to the nights when power was his oxygen. He thought about the men he had trusted and the men he had ordered to die. He thought about Meyer Lansky's quiet intelligence, Bugsy Siegel's fire, and Joe Masuria's greed. Each name carried a ghost, each ghost a story. Luciano had always known that death would come quietly for him. He had outlived his enemies, his rivals, his lovers, and even his friends. The newspapers had called him a criminal mastermind, a visionary, a tyrant, but beneath those headlines was something deeper, a man obsessed with control. He had built an empire on fear and friendship, but even empires crumble when their architects grow old. In his last years, Luciano seemed haunted not by what he had done, but by what he knew, the truths that had never made it to paper, the alliances between government and gangsters, the silent agreements that kept nations stable while crime ran free beneath their surface. As he waited in the lobby, he checked his pocket watch. 4:55 p.m. The producer was late. A strange chill crawled through his chest, like a whisper from fate. Around him, tourists passed by without recognition, no one realizing that this old man had once decided who lived and who died on the streets of New York. He smirked faintly. Power, he thought, is just a trick of memory. When you have it, you think it's eternal. When it's gone, you realize it was only borrowed time. He took another drag from his cigarette. The smoke curled upward, dissolving into nothing. He had always believed he would die in America, maybe in a prison cell or at a dinner table, shot by a man he once trusted. But instead, it seemed destiny had brought him here, to Italy, the land of his birth, where his story would end not with a bullet, but with silence. He felt his heart stutter once, then again, harder this time. His breath caught. The cigarette slipped from his fingers, landing near his polished shoes. For a moment, he tried to steady himself, gripping the armrest of the chair. His vision blurred. He could hear voices shouting, a waiter, a woman gasping, but they sounded far away, like echoes through a tunnel. In that brief final moment, images flashed through his mind, the neon lights of Manhattan, the roaring laughter of his men after a score, the thick envelopes of cash, the smell of expensive whiskey, and the cold eyes of those who had betrayed him. Then, everything went black. When the doctors arrived, it was already too late. Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the man who had once redefined organized crime, lay still on the marble floor of the Excelsior Hotel. In his pocket, they found a folded letter and a single gold watch, a relic of another life. The meeting never happened. The secrets he carried, the truths he might have spoken, died with him that evening. But the whispers began immediately, in Naples cafes, in American bars, in the dark corridors of memory. What had he been planning to say? Who had he been meeting? And what truth did he take to the grave? As the paramedics carried his body away, the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the city bathed in a soft, orange glow. It was as if the world itself paused for a moment to mark the end of an era. The streets that night were alive with music and laughter, but somewhere, beneath that noise, lingered the echo of a final conversation that would never be heard, a conversation between power, death, and the man who once ruled them both. New York City at the turn of the 20th century was a battlefield disguised as a city. Beneath its glittering skyline and booming factories, it was a place ruled not by law, but by hunger. Immigrants poured in through Ellis Island, eyes full of hope, pockets full of nothing. They came chasing the promise of America, and instead found a world of slums, sweatshops, and the desperate struggle for survival. The Lower East Side was a maze of tenements stacked on top of each other, rooms crawling with rats, children playing in gutters filled with ash. In those narrow streets, loyalty was currency, and violence was language. The Italian neighborhoods were small kingdoms of distrust. Men carried the traditions of Sicily and Naples in their blood, the old codes, the ancient vendettas, the whispered name of the Mafia that had crossed the ocean with them. But America was different. Here, there were no lords or peasants, no olive groves or dusty roads. Here, everyone was hungry. The Irish ran the docks, the Jews controlled the garment trade, and the Italians, newly arrived and despised by the police, clung together in their own corners of crime. It was not yet organized, it was chaos. Petty gangs fought over streets, extorted from local businesses, and killed each other for pennies. At night, the city breathed with menace. Policemen looked the other way for the right price. Judges could be bought with envelopes of cash. The newspapers spoke of "black hand" letters, crude notes written in broken English, demanding payment under threat of violence. It wasn't yet the Mafia, not in the way history would later know it. It was a primitive, scattered version of it, each man for himself, every neighborhood ruled by its own brand of fear. The old Italian code of omerta, the silence of honor, was still alive, but here it was twisted by poverty and ambition. Men didn't stay silent out of loyalty, they stayed silent out of terror. The early criminal world of New York was a tapestry of tribes. There was no hierarchy, no system, only survival. The Irish had their Tammany Hall connections, the Jewish gangs had intelligence and organization, but the Italians had something different: patience. They waited, watched, and adapted. In the bars of Mulberry Street and the back rooms of bakeries, whispers began to spread of men who could offer protection. It started with small rackets, loan sharking, gambling, smuggling cheap liquor from the docks. But every deal, every knife fight, every bribe laid the groundwork for something bigger. By 1910, the underworld was growing faster than the police could control it. Crime became industry. There were Italian enforcers who specialized in kidnappings, bootleggers smuggling whiskey before Prohibition even existed, and street bosses who collected taxes from every merchant on their block. The city was an ecosystem of corruption, and everyone, from the mayor's office to the lowest street peddler, played a role in feeding it. Yet, despite the chaos, one thing was missing: order. The old bosses, imported from Sicily, still ruled by outdated tradition. They distrusted outsiders, clung to old feuds, and refused to cooperate with anyone not born under their flag. The Jewish gangs, led by sharp minds like Arnold Rothstein, were already moving toward business models, treating crime like a company. But the Italians, divided and paranoid, were trapped in the past. They killed for pride, not profit. They followed leaders who acted like feudal kings in a modern city. It was this disunity that made New York ripe for transformation. Every street war, every broken truce, every corpse left in an alley was proof that the system could not survive as it was. The police called it organized crime, but it wasn't organized, not yet. It was a jungle of predators waiting for someone to turn it into a kingdom. Someone who could see beyond bloodlines and boundaries. Someone who understood that real power wasn't about who had the biggest gun, but who could make everyone else believe in the illusion of peace. In the background, Prohibition was looming like a storm cloud. The Volstead Act, when it arrived in 1920, would ban alcohol and hand criminals the greatest business opportunity in American history. But even before that, the seeds were there, the networks, the smuggling routes, the corrupt cops ready to look away. All it needed was a mind capable of shaping it, someone who could see the chaos not as a problem, but as a blueprint. Before Luciano, the Mafia in America was a patchwork of superstition and stubborn pride. After him, it would become a multinational corporation. But to understand what he built, one has to understand what came before him, the hunger, the dirt, the endless betrayals that ruled those early streets. He didn't invent crime, he perfected it. He saw the weakness in the old ways, the waste of talent, the self-destruction of endless vendettas, and he turned it into strategy. In those grimy streets, a new kind of criminal mind was being forged. Luciano wasn't alone in this evolution, there were others like him, young, ambitious men who were tired of the old bosses. They met in smoky backrooms, gambling dens, and speakeasies, talking not about revenge, but about business. They were modernists in a world of medieval men. They wanted to turn the Mafia into something sustainable, something untouchable. And though they didn't yet know it, the boy from Sicily, the one with the calm eyes and the dangerous charm, would soon give them exactly that. In the early 1910s, as the city buzzed with restless ambition, the underworld began to shift. The small-time thugs became soldiers. The neighborhood bosses became CEOs of vice. The gangs began to cooperate, not out of trust, but out of necessity. New York had become too profitable for chaos. The city was ready for its new ruler, and the streets, those restless arteries of ambition and greed, were already whispering his name. Long before Lucky Luciano ever took power, the world had already built the stage for him. All he had to do was step into the light. He was born Salvatore Lucania, in 1897, in a small Sicilian town called Lercara Fritti, a place where life was short, pride was long, and every man knew the weight of silence. His father was a sulfur miner, a man hardened by labor and poverty, and his mother a quiet, devout woman who prayed for the safety of her children in a world that rarely offered mercy. When the Lucania family boarded a ship to America in 1906, they carried little more than hope and exhaustion. For young Salvatore, the sight of the Statue of Liberty was not a promise, it was a challenge. New York's Lower East Side became their new battlefield. The streets were alive with hunger, carts of fruit and fish, gangs of boys fighting over stolen bread, and the endless noise of languages colliding. Salvatore, barely 10, quickly learned that kindness was a luxury. His father worked long hours trying to live an honest life, but honesty didn't pay rent. In the tenement rooms that smelled of sweat and boiled cabbage, dreams rotted faster than food. That's where young Salvatore began to understand a truth that would define his life. In America, morality was a game for those who could afford it. At school, he was restless, distracted, always calculating. His teachers called him trouble. The other boys called him lucky, after he started charging them nickels for protection from bullies. It was half a joke, until one of those bullies ended up with a broken nose. From that day on, the name stuck. The transformation had begun. Salvatore Lucania was gone, Lucky Luciano was being born. He joined the 5 Points Gang, one of the most notorious criminal organizations in the city, led by the legendary Paul Kelly. The 5 Points were a strange family, Italians, Jews, and Irish all mixed together, bound by the pursuit of money and survival. It was here that Luciano met the two men who would shape his destiny, Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Lansky, the quiet genius with a mathematical mind, and Siegel, the charming killer with fire in his veins. Together, they were a triangle of ambition, intellect, aggression, and vision. Luciano's early years on the streets were an education more valuable than any school could offer. He learned how to read people, the tilt of a chin, the twitch of an eye, the pause before a lie. He learned that fear could be bought, respect could be built, and loyalty could be broken with the right amount of money. Every deal, every fistfight, every con was a lesson in power. The police arrested him more than once for petty theft and assault, but each time he came out smarter, calmer, and more deliberate. He was never the loudest man in the room, he let others shout while he watched, memorized, and waited. In the chaos of the underworld, he began to see patterns. He noticed that the gangs wasted too much energy fighting over scraps when they could be sharing the feast. He started to think like a businessman long before anyone else did. In the years leading up to Prohibition, the streets were boiling with opportunity. Illegal gambling was everywhere, prostitution was an open secret, and liquor was about to become gold. Luciano and Lansky began to organize small gambling operations, running numbers and rigging games, while Bugsy enforced their interests with unflinching precision. They weren't just thugs, they were innovators, turning disorganized crime into a structured business. But power came with a price. Rival gangs saw Luciano's growing influence as a threat. He was beaten, robbed, even stabbed, yet somehow, he always survived. In 1923, he was kidnapped by rival bootleggers, beaten savagely, and left for dead in Staten Island. His face was slashed, his body broken, but he lived. From that moment on, people said he had been touched by luck, and the legend of Lucky Luciano became unshakable. But it wasn't luck that saved him, it was will. It was the mind of a man who refused to die because he hadn't finished building his empire. Luciano understood something that the old Sicilian bosses never could: the future of crime wasn't in family feuds, it was in cooperation. He began building bridges between Italian, Jewish, and Irish gangs, making alliances that shocked the old guard. He saw in Lansky's numbers the future of gambling, he saw in Siegel's fearlessness the muscle to protect it. Together, they built operations that made money faster than anyone had imagined possible. The young Luciano dressed sharp, tailored suits, polished shoes, silk ties. He looked more like a businessman than a criminal, and that was precisely his advantage. Police officers, judges, even politicians found themselves charmed by him. He paid when he had to, bribed when it mattered, and smiled when he didn't need to. Power, he realized, wasn't about control, it was about influence. And influence came from being indispensable to everyone who mattered. Still, the shadow of the old world followed him. Men like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, traditional Sicilian bosses, ruled their territories with iron fists and ancient rules. They looked down on Luciano's partnerships with non-Italians, seeing him as a traitor to their heritage. But Luciano had no interest in heritage, only in results. He wanted to build something bigger than any one family, something that could survive beyond bullets and bloodlines. By the late 1920s, Luciano had become a name whispered in both fear and respect. He was young, ambitious, and already more powerful than most of the older bosses realized. His operations stretched from the docks to the gambling dens, from the speakeasies to the union halls. He had money, allies, and vision, the three things no one could buy. And yet, beneath his calm surface, a storm was forming. The old ways were crumbling. The Castellammarese War, a bloody conflict between the traditional Mafia factions, was looming on the horizon. Luciano, still only in his early 30s, would soon be forced to choose between loyalty and evolution. The street kid who once sold protection for nickels was about to reshape the entire criminal world. But for now, in those years between youth and empire, Lucky Luciano walked the streets of New York as a man reborn, a child of Sicily turned architect of the American underworld. The lessons of poverty, fear, and ambition had fused into one unbreakable truth: in a world without mercy, power was the only religion worth believing in. The streets of New York were a classroom, and Lucky Luciano was its most promising student. By the time he reached his 20s, he had learned that survival was not enough, mastery was the goal. Every beating, every betrayal, every close call had refined his instincts. He was no longer just a street hustler, he was becoming something far more dangerous, a strategist. While others saw the city as a battleground, he saw it as a chessboard. Every block, every bar, every cop, and every gangster was a piece to be moved, bought, or sacrificed. Luciano's education was not in books, but in blood. He watched older gangsters like Joe Masuria, known as the Boss, and Salvatore Maranzano wage brutal wars over territory and pride. The so-called mustache Petes, traditional Sicilian dons who had brought their old-world values to America, ruled with superstition and fear. They demanded loyalty to bloodlines and villages, not logic or profit. They refused to work with non-Italians, refused to modernize, refused to adapt. Luciano, on the other hand, saw these men as relics, fossils trying to run an empire in a modern age. He respected their power, but he didn't admire their methods. They were too emotional, too proud, too predictable. Underneath their authority, Luciano built quietly. He managed prostitution rings, gambling operations, and bootlegging networks with efficiency and precision. During Prohibition, alcohol became liquid gold, and Luciano's network thrived. He had contacts on the docks, in the police department, and in the city government. He bribed officials with charm and precision, not desperation. He didn't see corruption as a necessary evil, he saw it as part of the system. In his mind, America wasn't a country of laws, it was a country of deals. He was meticulous about relationships. When he met someone useful, he remembered their name, their habits, their weaknesses. When he met someone dangerous, he smiled wider and listened more carefully. He never raised his voice, never showed anger, emotion was a weakness, and control was everything. That calmness unnerved people. Men who bragged about their kills, who boasted of their fortunes, often fell early. Luciano simply observed, and when the time was right, acted. His closest allies were not the kind the old bosses would have approved of. Meyer Lansky, the mathematical genius of gambling and finance, became Luciano's partner and conscience. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, reckless and fearless, became his enforcer and symbol of chaos under control. Together, they formed a new kind of criminal brotherhood, one based not on heritage, but on efficiency. To them, crime wasn't rebellion, it was enterprise. Luciano's relationship with Lansky was the most critical. Lansky taught him how to move money invisibly, how to turn illegal profits into legitimate businesses. Luciano, in turn, taught Lansky the art of manipulation, the theater of power. The two were opposites, one cold and calculating, the other charming and social. But together, they were unstoppable. As Prohibition raged, fortunes were made and lost overnight. Luciano saw chaos as opportunity. While the old dons waged wars over neighborhoods, he made alliances across boroughs. He worked with Irish bootleggers, Jewish smugglers, and corrupt dockworkers. He paid them fairly and treated them with respect, which made him something rare, a boss who inspired loyalty, not fear. Even those who envied him could not help but admire his balance of charisma and ruthlessness. Still, he understood that power without protection was temporary. To survive, he needed both muscle and image. He cultivated relationships with politicians, businessmen, and even social elites. He dressed immaculately, spoke calmly, and never appeared desperate. He once said, "The real power is when you can afford to keep quiet." That became his philosophy. Let others scream their victories, Luciano preferred to own the silence that followed. But he was not immune to danger. Rival factions saw his independence as betrayal. Joe Masuria, the reigning Italian boss, demanded his loyalty. Luciano played the role of the obedient soldier, smiling in Masuria's presence while quietly undermining him behind the scenes. He understood that violence was a tool, not a habit, and the most effective strikes were the ones nobody saw coming. It was during this time that Luciano survived one of the most defining events of his life, the kidnapping that nearly ended it. In 1923, after refusing to cooperate with a rival gang, he was abducted, beaten savagely, stabbed, and left for dead on a Staten Island beach. His attackers thought they had made their point. But Luciano rose from that beating with something stronger than vengeance, clarity. The scars on his face became part of his legend, a reminder to others that he was unkillable. From that moment on, his nickname, Lucky, took on mythic weight. But to him, survival wasn't luck. It was discipline. It was control. He began studying how legitimate corporations operated. He noticed how big businesses expanded through partnerships, mergers, and shared profits, not endless infighting. Why couldn't the underworld do the same? Why couldn't crime be structured like a company, with bosses acting as executives and soldiers as employees? It was a revolutionary idea in a world that had always been ruled by ego. Luciano started experimenting with this model. He reduced turf wars by making deals with other gangs, offering them shares of profits instead of bullets. He punished greed, rewarded loyalty, and insisted on professionalism. No unnecessary killings, no chaos that attracted police attention. The underworld began to run smoother, quieter, and more profitably. Even some of his enemies began to see the sense in his methods. But for all his intelligence, Luciano knew that change came with risk. The old dons wouldn't tolerate innovation forever. They saw his partnerships with Jews and Irishmen as an insult, a betrayal of Sicilian purity. To them, he was dangerous, not because he disobeyed orders, but because he was right. They could sense the future in him, and it terrified them. Behind his easy smile, Luciano began plotting the downfall of the old order. He saw that to build the modern Mafia, he would first have to destroy the old one. But for now, he waited, carefully, quietly, watching the old bosses weaken themselves through greed and pride. He played the loyal subordinate, the polite Italian who nodded at every command. But inside, he was sharpening his blade, not for revenge, but for revolution. Each night, when the streets of New York shimmered with illegal whiskey and forbidden jazz, Luciano's empire grew stronger in the shadows. He was still young, but his control over the underworld was tightening. He had learned the art of patience, the discipline of restraint, and the genius of calculated betrayal. The boy who once sold protection on the street corner was now preparing to protect, and rule, the entire criminal world. The city around him was restless, violent, and alive. Every alleyway was a memory, every handshake a risk. But Luciano no longer feared risk, he thrived on it. His mind was no longer bound by the limits of gang warfare, he was thinking in empires. Soon, his vision would find its moment in history. Soon, he would step out of the shadows and rewrite the laws of organized crime forever. Luciano had transformed from street kid to strategist, but the true turning point of his life, the moment he stepped into the role of a kingpin, came during the chaos of the Castellammarese War. By the late 1920s, the Italian underworld in New York was a powder keg, split between the old Sicilian bosses known as the Mustache Petes and the younger, ambitious mobsters eager to modernize. On one side stood Joe Masuria, a brutal and calculating don who demanded absolute loyalty from his men. On the other stood Salvatore Maranzano, a traditionalist who believed in the sacred hierarchy of the Sicilian Mafia, whose rule was enforced by intimidation, superstition, and unyielding pride. The city was saturated with tension, and every street corner could erupt in violence at any moment. Luciano, though still young, understood that this conflict was more than a war between gangs, it was a war for the future of organized crime itself. He observed quietly at first, noting the weaknesses of both factions. Masuria was clever but paranoid, a man who trusted force over intelligence. Maranzano was rigid, consumed by old-world customs that made him predictable. Both were brilliant in their own ways, but neither could adapt to a changing city, a city now dominated by prohibition, where money flowed in secret rivers and opportunity favored the bold. Luciano realized that neither Masuria nor Maranzano could control the future, but together, they created the perfect environment for him to rise. Luciano's approach was methodical. He didn't rush into battles, nor did he allow emotion to cloud his judgment. Instead, he began to cultivate loyalty from within both camps. He built alliances with men disillusioned by the old guard, young, ambitious soldiers who wanted power but were tired of ritualistic violence. He offered them something revolutionary: protection, profit, and a vision of a world where killing was a tool, not an endless ritual. This subtle shift in perspective earned him respect from some of the most dangerous men in the city. At the same time, Luciano nurtured his public image carefully. He dressed impeccably, spoke politely, and maintained a calm demeanor that masked a lethal intelligence. He was charming when he needed to be, ruthless when it was necessary, and always patient. People underestimated him because he did not behave like a traditional boss, he did not rely on theatrics or fear alone. His power was quiet, built in the shadows, where the rules of old-world loyalty were already crumbling. The Castellamarese war escalated rapidly. Street shootings, bombings, and assassinations plagued Italian neighborhoods, and both sides suffered losses. Masuria demanded absolute obedience, while Maranzano imposed strict codes that left little room for negotiation. Amid the chaos, Luciano saw the opportunity that would define his career. He understood that to survive and thrive, he would have to make a decision that was as dangerous as it was unprecedented, to betray his own mentor. The night he killed Masuria was calculated to perfection. He had spent months arranging meetings, observing routines, and ensuring that every move was controlled. He convinced Masuria to dine with him in a downtown restaurant, an invitation Masuria accepted without suspicion. Luciano knew the men at his side, gunmen loyal not to Masuria, but to him, were ready. When the moment came, the shooting was swift, precise, and merciless. Masuria was dead. The old order had lost its head. In the aftermath, Luciano did not simply claim power, he reshaped it. He absorbed Masuria's men, negotiated with rival factions, and ensured that Maranzano could not immediately consolidate control. He demonstrated a new kind of leadership, one based on pragmatism, not tradition. Violence remained a tool, but it was now guided by strategy and foresight. Murder was no longer ritualistic, it was instrumental. This was the birth of the modern Mafia in America. Maranzano, sensing the threat, attempted to consolidate power under his own terms, crowning himself boss of all bosses. But Luciano recognized that Maranzano's approach was doomed. He relied on fear, tradition, and hierarchy, all things that worked against adaptability. Within months, Luciano orchestrated Maranzano's assassination as well, using the same combination of careful planning, loyal executioners, and timing that had removed Masuria. In doing so, he eliminated the old-world structure entirely, clearing a path for his vision, a mafia governed by rules of business rather than bloodline. Luciano's rise was not just about brute force, it was about psychology. He understood that respect could be earned through intelligence, loyalty could be cultivated through shared profit, and fear could be tempered with subtle control. His alliances with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel proved invaluable. Lansky's financial acumen ensured that gambling and money laundering operations were sophisticated, while Siegel's fearless enforcement kept rivals in check. Together, they transformed criminal enterprise into something almost corporate, complete with networks, protocols, and strategic planning. This period also revealed Luciano's unique ability to merge the old with the new. He honored certain aspects of Sicilian tradition, the codes of secrecy, the value of loyalty, while discarding outdated rituals that slowed progress. He demonstrated that power could be both feared and admired, that a leader could be ruthless yet strategic, and that a criminal empire could operate with the precision of a legitimate business. By the early 1930s, Luciano had emerged not just as a boss, but as the architect of a new order. He had survived the most violent war in New York's history, eliminated his rivals, and established a network that spanned boroughs and ethnicities. His influence reached beyond the streets, touching politicians, law enforcement, and even union leaders. The Mafia was no longer a collection of chaotic factions, it was a structured organization with him at its center. The making of Luciano as a Don was more than a rise to power, it was a transformation of the underworld itself. He demonstrated that intelligence, patience, and strategic vision could outmatch brute force. The boy from Sicily, who had once sold protection for nickels, had become the man who would redefine crime in America. From this moment on, his empire was not just about survival or profit, it was about creating a system that could endure beyond the lives of any single man, including himself. The streets of New York would never be the same. Under Luciano, chaos was no longer the law, order was. But this order came at a cost. Every action he took created enemies as well as allies, and every strategic move planted seeds of future conflict. Yet Luciano understood the paradox: to build an empire, one must take risks that others fear, make decisions that others avoid, and sometimes betray even those they claim to love. And in doing so, he had become not just a boss, but a visionary, the first true dawn of modern organized crime. The Castellamarese War had ended, the old bosses eliminated, and the streets of New York were finally quiet enough to hear a new order taking shape. Luciano, now firmly in control, faced a challenge that no single act of violence could solve: how to maintain power in a world built on betrayal, ego, and ambition. The old way of running the Mafia, through fear, bloodline loyalty, and superstition, was over. He needed something entirely new, something that could survive generations of violence and greed. It was here that Luciano conceived the idea of the Commission, a governing council of organized crime, a revolutionary blueprint for the American Mafia. The Commission was not just a power grab, it was a structural revolution. Luciano understood that centralized authority was essential to prevent the bloody infighting that had nearly destroyed the Mafia during the Castellamarese War. Instead of one supreme boss, he proposed a council where leaders of different families would meet to resolve disputes, divide territories, and regulate operations like a corporation. Violence would remain a tool, but it would be strategically sanctioned rather than impulsive. It was a system designed to create stability in a world inherently unstable, an idea no one had dared to implement before. Luciano's vision required allies who were capable, loyal, and intelligent. He turned to Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, who had proven their skill in both financial acumen and enforcement. He also extended his reach to leaders outside the Italian community, forming pragmatic alliances with Jewish and Irish gangsters. These partnerships were unprecedented. By collaborating across ethnic lines, Luciano created a network that could move goods, launder money, and control vice on a scale that no traditional boss could. It was the first real globalization of organized crime, a model of efficiency disguised as criminal enterprise. The Commission functioned as a board of directors. Each family had representation, and decisions affecting the Mafia at large were made collectively. Territories were assigned, disputes were mediated, and large-scale operations like gambling, bootlegging, and labor racketeering were coordinated to maximize profit and minimize conflict. Luciano's genius was in balancing power. No single family could dominate, but every family had enough influence to feel invested. By doing this, he ensured loyalty without relying solely on fear, creating a system that outlasted individual ambitions. This approach also required psychological insight. Luciano knew that men craved respect as much as wealth, and he used this understanding to maintain authority. He allowed families to maintain their own identity and pride, even while imposing rules that limited their capacity for reckless violence. A well-timed meeting at the Commission, a calm but firm rebuke, or a discreet financial incentive could prevent wars that would have otherwise decimated neighborhoods. Power, in Luciano's hands, became a blend of carrot and stick, a delicate orchestration that required both cunning and patience. At the same time, Luciano expanded his business empire. He streamlined gambling operations, moving them from scattered street corners to coordinated networks that spanned the city and beyond. He modernized bootlegging, using warehouses, trucks, and legitimate businesses as cover. Labor unions, once instruments of chaos, were now manipulated to control docks and shipments, ensuring a steady flow of resources and revenue. Prostitution rings were professionalized, with rules, payments, and oversight, reducing police attention and increasing profits. Every illegal enterprise was treated like a division in a corporate conglomerate, and Luciano's leadership style mirrored that of a CEO more than a traditional mob boss. But perhaps the most radical innovation was Luciano's ability to merge business with diplomacy. He understood that the Mafia could not operate in isolation, it needed to coexist with politicians, law enforcement, and other sectors of society. Bribes, favors, and silent agreements became as critical as guns and loyalty. Luciano's contacts were everywhere: the docks, City Hall, the police precincts, and the courts. He ensured that his operations were protected by a combination of influence and intimidation. He didn't just rule the streets, he manipulated the entire system surrounding them. Luciano's ability to see beyond violence and hierarchy allowed him to transform the Mafia from a collection of feuding families into a sustainable organization. Under his guidance, killings were no longer acts of pride but instruments of policy. Territorial disputes were resolved with negotiation rather than bloodshed. Alliances were forged not through marriage or tradition, but through shared interest and mutual benefit. This strategic rationalization of crime was something the older generation of bosses could never comprehend. For them, power was personal and violent; for Luciano, it was structural and enduring. The establishment of the commission also created a cultural shift within the Mafia. Younger members began to see organized crime not as a chaotic street war, but as a career with advancement, rules, and long-term planning. The concept of professional loyalty replaced blind obedience, and strategic thinking replaced impulsive aggression. Under Luciano, crime was no longer merely survival, it was a calculated, disciplined enterprise designed to endure and profit. Yet, this vision was not without its challenges. Some traditionalists resisted, clinging to superstition and old codes. Rival families occasionally tested boundaries, forcing Luciano to balance diplomacy with decisive action. Each confrontation was a lesson in control, showing that true power required both fear and respect. Luciano's charisma, patience, and intellect allowed him to navigate these obstacles with remarkable efficiency. By the mid-1930s, the American Mafia had become a sophisticated network capable of managing risk, maximizing profit, and maintaining relative peace among powerful factions. The streets were quieter, the operations more efficient, and the empire more resilient than ever before. Luciano's innovations had transformed the underworld from a collection of disorganized gangs into a corporate-style network that could weather both law enforcement and internal conflict. The genius of the commission lay not only in its structure but in its philosophy. Power was strongest when it was decentralized, yet coordinated, when fear was tempered by respect, when profit was prioritized over pride. Luciano's vision had created a model that would influence organized crime for decades, extending far beyond New York, far beyond his lifetime. He had not merely survived the chaos of the Castellamarese War, he had reinvented the rules of the game. Through the commission, Luciano institutionalized the very idea of organized crime as a modern enterprise. The Mafia was no longer a series of violent feuds or impulsive street killings. It was a machine, precise, efficient, and immensely profitable. And at the center of this machine stood Lucky Luciano, the man who had turned the chaos of New York streets into a structured empire, a visionary who had made crime not only deadly but enduring. In every alliance, every meeting, and every calculated move, Luciano's influence extended beyond mere survival. He created an architecture of crime that demanded obedience and offered reward, ensuring that the legacy of his leadership would survive long after the streets he once walked had grown quiet. The commission was more than a council, it was a new world order, and Luciano had become the architect of modern organized crime. Power is never absolute, and even the most brilliant architect of crime must navigate a web of allies, enemies, and shifting loyalties. For Lucky Luciano, this reality became apparent as he consolidated control over the American Mafia. By the mid-1930s, his empire spanned the 5 boroughs of New York, extending into Chicago, Miami, and beyond. Yet, as his influence grew, so too did the scrutiny of rivals, law enforcement, and those within his own ranks. Maintaining dominance required a careful balance of diplomacy, intimidation, and psychological insight, a combination Luciano had perfected over years of observation and trial. Allies were Luciano's lifeline. Meyer Lansky, the calculating financial strategist, became more than a friend, he was a partner who could anticipate market trends, laundering schemes, and the movement of illegal revenue streams with mathematical precision. Lansky's genius allowed Luciano to expand gambling networks and launder profits with a sophistication few rivals could match. Benjamin "Bugsy" Siegel, reckless yet fearless, served as muscle and enforcer, capable of intimidating anyone who questioned Luciano's authority. Together, the trio created a synergy of intellect, audacity, and force, transforming street-level operations into coordinated, multi-state enterprises. Luciano also cultivated alliances with rival factions, even those traditionally hostile to Italians. Irish and Jewish gangs were brought into the fold through shared financial interests, protection deals, and occasionally, subtle coercion. These alliances were pragmatic rather than sentimental, but they were indispensable. By working with unlikely partners, Luciano expanded his operational reach while minimizing open conflict, creating a network that functioned like a modern corporation, interdependent, efficient, and resilient. However, every ally carried risk. Trust in the underworld was never unconditional. Soldiers who appeared loyal could betray a boss for the right combination of fear or reward. Luciano was acutely aware that friendships in this world were transactional, respect had to be earned, and allegiance maintained through subtle management. He rewarded loyalty handsomely, but he also made examples of those who strayed, ensuring that each act of disloyalty had consequences that echoed throughout the organization. Enemies, on the other hand, were as essential to his strategy as allies. They provided challenges that tested his acumen and reminded him of the fragility of power. Men like Joe Adonis, Vincent Mangano, and Albert Anastasia were influential figures whose ambitions could destabilize the empire if left unchecked. Luciano employed a combination of negotiation, bribery, and selective violence to neutralize threats, ensuring that potential challengers were either co-opted or eliminated. Each maneuver was calculated, designed to maintain balance and prevent chaos. One of Luciano's most dangerous rivalries was with Frank Costello, a man of equal intelligence and ambition. Costello was deeply entrenched in gambling and political corruption, and his influence extended into City Hall. Luciano navigated this relationship with care, recognizing Costello's value as both ally and threat. They formed a symbiotic connection, Costello managing political avenues while Luciano controlled the operational backbone of the Mafia. It was a delicate dance, one misstep of which could have triggered open warfare. Luciano's interactions with law enforcement and government officials added another layer of complexity. Corruption was widespread, but he understood that even the most pliable officials could become liabilities. Bribes, favors, and discreet warnings ensured that investigations moved slowly or veered off course, but he never assumed absolute safety. The constant pressure from authorities meant that every decision carried stakes far beyond the underworld. Miscalculations could lead to arrests, convictions, or assassinations, a reminder that power, even at its height, was precarious. Betrayal was never far from his thoughts. Men he trusted could turn on him in an instant, motivated by greed, fear, or revenge. Luciano learned to read subtle cues, a hesitation in speech, a flicker of the eye, a hand that lingered too long on a weapon. His ability to anticipate betrayal became one of his greatest assets, allowing him to preempt threats before they materialized. In this world, knowledge was survival, and Luciano amassed it relentlessly. Despite the constant tension, Luciano maintained a veneer of calm and charm. He was a master of psychological framing, understanding that perception often mattered more than reality. Publicly, he appeared composed, approachable, and even generous. Behind closed doors, he made decisions that could destroy a man's career, family, or life. This duality, the blending of civility and ruthlessness, became a hallmark of his leadership, inspiring both loyalty and fear in equal measure. Family ties, too, were complex. While blood relatives were not automatically trusted, some proved useful in managing local operations and maintaining a sense of continuity. Yet even here, he placed loyalty and competence above lineage, a revolutionary departure from the traditions of the Sicilian Mafia. This meritocratic approach fostered efficiency but also created tension among traditionalists who resented the elevation of outsiders and younger men. Luciano's empire was a study in contrasts, cooperation and competition, friendship and fear, negotiation and violence. He understood that stability was not guaranteed, it was cultivated. Each ally had a role, each enemy a purpose, and every decision rippled through the network like shockwaves. His genius lay not in brute strength but in his ability to orchestrate these relationships, ensuring that power flowed through him even when he was not present. The period following the consolidation of power was marked by careful expansion. Luciano diversified operations into gambling, narcotics, prostitution, and labor racketeering. He leveraged alliances to control ports, unions, and illicit markets, creating revenue streams that were both extensive and resilient. Simultaneously, he maintained internal discipline, punishing disobedience while rewarding initiative. This balance of fear and incentive allowed the Mafia to function like a well-oiled machine, generating wealth and influence that extended far beyond New York. Yet, for all his control, Luciano remained aware of the fragility of his position. Power in the underworld was a constant negotiation, and even the most loyal ally could become a competitor. The need for vigilance was endless. He cultivated intelligence networks, ensuring that every corner of the city was under observation, every movement monitored, and every potential threat assessed. Through strategic alliances, careful management of enemies, and psychological mastery, Luciano built an empire that seemed invincible. But the very complexity of his power also contained seeds of vulnerability. Rivalries, shifting loyalties, and the ever-present threat of law enforcement meant that maintaining dominance required constant attention, foresight, and adaptability. In this environment, Luciano thrived. He navigated the treacherous landscape with precision, turning threats into opportunities, enemies into partners, and chaos into profit. His ability to manage both people and systems was unparalleled, establishing a blueprint for leadership within organized crime that would endure long after his personal rise. The delicate balance of allies and enemies, negotiation and intimidation, loyalty and fear, became the defining characteristic of his reign, securing his place not just as a mob boss, but as the architect of modern organized crime. The underworld is never static. Even after consolidating power, Lucky Luciano understood that control was fragile, and dominance had to be maintained through constant vigilance. The late 1930s were a period of hidden wars, subtle, invisible, yet deadly. The streets of New York no longer echoed with open gunfire as they had during the Castellammarese War, but the conflicts had not disappeared, they had merely evolved. Violence had been replaced in many cases by strategic manipulation, economic pressure, and covert operations designed to maintain supremacy without attracting undue attention from law enforcement. Luciano's genius lay in orchestrating these hidden wars with precision, ensuring that the Mafia's machinery ran smoothly while rivals were neutralized quietly. Luciano's enemies were varied and cunning. There were traditionalists who resented his modern approach, men like Joe Adonis and Vincent Mangano, whose adherence to old-world codes made them unpredictable threats. There were ambitious young lieutenants, eager to expand their territories, whose allegiance to Luciano was conditional at best. And there were external forces, police investigations, federal agents, and politicians, each capable of disrupting his empire if mismanaged. The underworld was a complex ecosystem, and Luciano was both its predator and its caretaker. To maintain control, Luciano employed a combination of diplomacy and intimidation. He mediated disputes between families, brokered agreements that prevented turf wars, and ensured that profitable ventures were divided in ways that minimized resentment. Each settlement reinforced his authority. He was not merely a boss, he was an arbiter, the central figure whose approval could stabilize or destabilize the city. At the same time, he deployed selective violence against those who challenged his rules. Hits were precise, executed by trusted men, and designed to send a message without sparking full-scale war. This balance of force and negotiation was revolutionary, demonstrating that power could be maintained through strategy rather than brute strength alone. The hidden war extended beyond New York. Luciano's influence reached Chicago, Miami, and even Havana, where operations like gambling and bootlegging required careful coordination with local factions. Rival mobs in these cities often tested the limits of his authority, attempting to encroach on territories or poach profitable ventures. Luciano's response was swift but calculated. He combined financial incentives, alliances, and, when necessary, targeted violence to maintain control. He understood that perception was as important as reality. By projecting omnipresence and authority, he discouraged challenges before they could materialize. One of the most critical aspects of these hidden wars was Luciano's ability to manipulate law enforcement and politicians. Corruption was not just a tool, it was a weapon. Bribes and favors ensured that investigations stalled, witnesses disappeared, and rivals faced pressure from unexpected quarters. Luciano's network of influence extended into City Hall, the docks, and the courts, allowing him to operate in relative safety while enemies were entangled in legal and financial difficulties. His mastery of these indirect strategies amplified his power while minimizing overt risk, a hallmark of his leadership. Even within his own organization, the battles were subtle yet dangerous. Soldiers and lieutenants often tested boundaries, seeking greater autonomy or attempting to assert dominance over specific operations. Luciano responded with careful management, rewarding loyalty, mentoring promising figures like Frank Costello and Vito Genovese, and removing threats discreetly. The key was to maintain cohesion without appearing authoritarian. The Mafia functioned as a collective, and any perception of tyranny could spark rebellion. Luciano's psychological insight was critical. He understood ambition, fear, and ego better than anyone, using each to maintain equilibrium. Labor racketeering, gambling, and narcotics operations became arenas for these hidden conflicts. Competing crews tried to intercept shipments, influence union leaders, or undercut each other's profits. Luciano implemented strict protocols for territory, revenue sharing, and enforcement, ensuring that disputes could be managed internally without open warfare. He also cultivated intelligence networks, relying on informants, trusted lieutenants, and observation to anticipate challenges before they became threats. In this way, the Mafia functioned like a corporate enterprise, with conflict contained and resources optimized. The psychology of these hidden wars was equally critical. Luciano knew that fear alone could not maintain loyalty. Respect, opportunity, and mutual benefit were equally essential. By granting rewards to effective operatives, offering protection to those under threat, and strategically punishing disloyalty, he created a culture where compliance was advantageous. Men followed him not only out of fear but because aligning with Luciano promised survival and profit. This subtle cultivation of loyalty made him nearly untouchable in a world built on betrayal. At the same time, external threats continued to loom. Federal investigations into organized crime were intensifying, particularly with the rise of Prohibition-era legislation and anti-racketeering statutes. Luciano anticipated these pressures, positioning his organization to insulate key leaders, diversify operations, and obscure financial flows. He leveraged political connections to delay prosecutions, influence juries, and manipulate outcomes. Every move was part of a larger strategy to maintain dominance while appearing invisible to those who might disrupt it. Rival factions occasionally forced confrontations, but these were managed with calculated precision. Disputes over territory, business interests, or personal vendettas were resolved through negotiation backed by implicit threat. Assassinations were not random acts of vengeance but tactical strikes designed to maintain the balance of power. By controlling both the narrative and the action, Luciano turned the hidden war into a mechanism for reinforcing authority rather than a destabilizing force. Throughout these years, Luciano's ability to see the bigger picture set him apart. While others fought impulsively for pride or territory, he approached every conflict as a chessboard, anticipating moves several steps ahead. He understood that the true danger was not always immediate. Slow erosion of loyalty, infiltration by rivals, and mismanaged resources could be as lethal as bullets. His vigilance, foresight, and intelligence allowed him to maintain dominance without constantly resorting to violence, a feat that elevated him above most contemporaries. By the late 1930s, Luciano's hidden wars had transformed the Mafia into a highly disciplined organization. Violence was controlled, disputes were managed, and operations were optimized. His enemies had been neutralized or co-opted, allies remained loyal, and the organization functioned with unprecedented efficiency. Yet he never became complacent. Power in the underworld was fluid, and he understood that the next challenge could emerge from any direction: an ambitious lieutenant, a rival family, or the relentless pressure of law enforcement. In this intricate web of covert operations, alliances, and threats, Luciano thrived. The hidden war became a proving ground for his intellect, strategy, and psychological insight. It was here that he cemented his reputation as a leader who could command not just obedience, but calculated loyalty, manipulate perception, and maintain control in the most dangerous and unpredictable environment imaginable. The underworld was no longer merely a battleground, it had become Luciano's domain, operating under rules he had designed, with him as the unseen architect of its order. The facade of control and power that lucky Luciano had so meticulously constructed began to show cracks in the late 1930s. Despite his genius in managing alliances, enemies, and hidden wars, he was not invincible. The very visibility that came with his rise to power made him a target for law enforcement, rival factions, and ambitious underlings. His empire was immense, but so were the risks. By now, the streets of New York and beyond were no longer just a playground for the Mafia, they were a stage for scrutiny, investigation, and betrayal. Luciano had always understood that success brought enemies, but he underestimated the growing determination of federal authorities, emboldened by new anti-racketeering laws, to bring him down. It began subtly. Small raids, whispered rumors, and internal betrayals started to chip away at the sense of invincibility he had long enjoyed. Men he had once trusted began to falter, tempted by promises of leniency or profit from law enforcement. In a world where loyalty was transactional, even his most devoted lieutenants could be swayed by opportunity or fear. Luciano's network, vast and intricate, was suddenly exposed to vulnerabilities he could not control from a distance. Every meeting carried the weight of potential betrayal, every alliance required constant reaffirmation. The empire he had built on precision and foresight now demanded more vigilance than ever before. The government, under the leadership of determined prosecutors and agents, began to focus on Luciano as the linchpin of organized crime in America. They understood that taking him down would destabilize the entire Mafia infrastructure. Task forces collected evidence meticulously, infiltrated operations, and cultivated informants. The legal pressure intensified when federal authorities began connecting Luciano to a web of crimes: extortion, illegal gambling, prostitution rings, and labor racketeering. While many mobsters operated in the shadows, Luciano's prominence made him impossible to ignore, and the weight of visibility was beginning to tilt the scales against him. Meanwhile, rival factions and old enemies sensed an opportunity. Some attempted to exploit the pressure Luciano faced from law enforcement, subtly undermining his authority and testing the loyalty of his lieutenants. The underworld, once carefully stabilized under the Commission, now risked internal fracturing. It was a delicate balance: a single misstep could ignite chaos, invite assassination attempts, or even spark the resurgence of violent turf wars. Luciano, ever the strategist, had to counter these pressures while simultaneously fending off legal threats, a dual-front battle that tested every skill he had honed over decades. In the midst of these pressures, Luciano's personal life also became entangled in his downfall. His high-profile lifestyle, once a calculated display of charm and influence, drew media attention that amplified the scrutiny. Friends and associates were interrogated, financial transactions were traced, and even minor indiscretions were magnified. For a man who had built an empire in secrecy, the exposure was dangerous. Every decision, previously guided by calculated discretion, now carried heightened risk, and every association could be used as leverage by prosecutors. Then came the pivotal arrest. Luciano was indicted on charges that would eventually culminate in a federal trial. The evidence against him was extensive, yet the most damning aspect was not just his operations, but the betrayal of those he had once considered allies. Informants and witnesses, incentivized or intimidated, provided testimony that pierced the veil of invincibility he had so carefully maintained. It was a moment that illustrated a harsh truth of the underworld: in a life built on crime, loyalty could be temporary, and survival often required others to fall first. The public spectacle of the arrest sent shockwaves through New York. Newspapers splashed his name across headlines, painting him as both criminal mastermind and symbolic figure of organized crime. The media frenzy created a dual-edged sword. On one hand, it amplified fear and respect among his peers; on the other, it magnified his vulnerabilities, giving law enforcement and rivals alike insight into his operations and networks. The carefully managed silence that had once protected him was replaced by scrutiny and speculation, and the empire that had seemed unshakable began to feel exposed. During this period, Luciano's psychological acumen was tested like never before. He was forced to confront the consequences of a life built on calculated risks. Every ally had to be reassured, every rival monitored, and every legal maneuver scrutinized. The patience, discipline, and strategic brilliance that had fueled his rise were now applied in defense, a reversal of roles that required adapting to a world in which control was no longer absolute. Every conversation, every interaction, carried weight; every misjudgment could be fatal. As the trial approached, the stakes escalated. Luciano faced not only the threat of imprisonment but also the disintegration of the very structure he had spent years building. The underworld, though guided by the Commission, was vulnerable to destabilization. His lieutenants, wary of the increasing attention from law enforcement, began to hedge their bets, aligning themselves with alternative power centers. The Mafia's delicate equilibrium, so carefully orchestrated by Luciano, was under siege from both legal and internal pressures simultaneously. Despite the mounting pressure, Luciano never lost his strategic composure. He prepared for the trial with meticulous attention, employing legal counsel and strategists while simultaneously maintaining his grip on operations from behind the scenes. Yet, he could not eliminate all threats. The combined forces of law enforcement, public scrutiny, and shifting loyalties began to erode the certainty that had once been his hallmark. Every success, every previous act of cunning, now had to be defended against forces both visible and hidden. This period of mounting vulnerability marked the beginning of the fall. The arrest and subsequent legal battles symbolized the first real cracks in the armor of a man who had long seemed untouchable. While he still commanded respect and fear, the inevitability of consequences had arrived, a reminder that even the most brilliant architects of power were not immune to the forces they sought to manipulate. In these early days of his downfall, Luciano learned that survival required adaptation beyond strategy or intimidation. He had to navigate betrayal, political pressure, and the relentless machinery of justice. The empire he had built with patience, intelligence, and ruthlessness was now threatened by circumstances that could not be controlled through force alone. The fall had begun, a slow, calculated descent from dominance, where every decision could determine whether he would emerge intact or see his carefully constructed world crumble around him. The streets that had once obeyed his silent commands now whispered of vulnerability. Allies were cautious, enemies emboldened, and the law relentless. Luciano faced the most dangerous conflict of his life, one not of bullets and blood, but of strategy, deception, and survival. His empire, once a testament to ingenuity and power, was being tested by forces as inevitable as time itself. The fall had begun, and lucky Luciano would soon discover that the greatest battles are often fought not in open warfare, but in the shadowy corridors of betrayal, law, and human ambition. The courtroom was a battlefield unlike any lucky Luciano had faced before. No gunmen, no silent observers, no carefully cultivated informants, only law, procedure, and the weight of public scrutiny. As he entered the trial, the man who had orchestrated empires, controlled alliances, and commanded fear across the underworld now faced a new type of adversary, the American justice system. For the first time in his life, Luciano could not rely on cunning alone; every detail, every word, and every expression was subject to interpretation. The stakes were immense, not only for him personally but for the entire structure of the modern mafia he had built. From the very beginning, the trial was a spectacle. Newspapers splashed his name across the front pages, painting him simultaneously as a criminal mastermind and a symbol of moral decay in society. The public was fascinated and repulsed in equal measure, eager to witness the unraveling of a man whose influence had stretched far beyond the streets. Reporters chronicled every courtroom drama, the carefully orchestrated appearances, the silent exchanges with lawyers, the subtle gestures that betrayed either confidence or caution. For the public, Luciano became both legend and cautionary tale, the embodiment of power tested by consequence. Inside the courtroom, the dynamics were tense and charged. Witnesses, some coerced and some incentivized, testified to his involvement in illegal gambling, extortion, labor racketeering, and prostitution. Every testimony was layered with drama, carefully scrutinized by both the prosecution and defense. The legal teams worked tirelessly, cross-examining and defending, as Luciano sat poised and calculating. His outward calm belied the storm within. He knew that the outcome could redefine not only his life but the survival of the intricate network of operations he had built over years. The trial was as much a psychological theater as it was a legal proceeding. Luciano had long understood the importance of perception, and now the perception of the public and jury became a weapon and a shield. He maintained a composed exterior, using charm and controlled demeanor to project confidence. The prosecution sought to paint him as a violent, manipulative figure who ruled through fear alone. The defense worked to humanize him, emphasizing his business acumen and the loyalty of his associates. Every move was calculated to sway opinion, to create doubt, and to buy time, all crucial in the high-stakes environment of federal justice. Yet, for all his preparation, Luciano faced the reality of betrayal. Some who had once followed him unquestioningly provided evidence against him, either through fear of prosecution or in exchange for reduced sentences. These betrayals cut deep. In a world built on loyalty and calculated trust, the courtroom exposed vulnerabilities that even he had struggled to anticipate. Every word from a witness, every document produced, chipped away at the narrative he had carefully maintained. The invisible walls he had built around himself, to shield his operations and reputation, were being pierced in real time. The media frenzy amplified the tension. Newsreels, newspapers, and radio broadcasts turned the trial into a national spectacle. Each session of testimony was dissected, analyzed, and sensationalized, creating a pressure cooker environment where public opinion weighed heavily. Luciano's image, meticulously curated over years of careful management, was now subject to interpretation by millions who had no knowledge of the subtle strategies, the alliances, and the careful orchestration that had defined his rise. The courtroom became a theater in which both his past and his persona were on trial, and every misstep threatened to sway the balance irrevocably. One of the defining moments of the trial was the presentation of financial records and gambling operations that demonstrated the scope of Luciano's empire. Witnesses described the intricacies of labor racketeering, the control of unions, and the clandestine flow of funds. The prosecution painted a picture of a criminal genius whose influence had corrupted entire industries, while the defense countered with arguments about the necessity of secrecy, the inevitability of entrepreneurial risk, and the limited role of violence in modern operations. The tension between fact, perception, and legal interpretation created a complex narrative that tested the jury's ability to separate myth from reality. Throughout the trial, Luciano's composure remained his most potent weapon. Unlike others who might have cracked under pressure, he maintained a calm exterior, meeting accusations with measured responses, and letting others reveal their emotions. His intelligence, patience, and ability to read the room allowed him to subtly manipulate perceptions, reinforcing loyalty among his supporters while casting doubt in the minds of jurors and observers. Every gesture, every pause, every carefully chosen word was part of a larger strategy to survive the ordeal intact. The trial also exposed the fragility of the criminal network he had built. Associates once relied upon for protection and loyalty were now liabilities, forced into cooperation with prosecutors. Operations that had seemed secure were scrutinized, and the intricate web of alliances and financial dealings became evidence against him. The experience underscored a harsh reality: in the underworld, as in life, control is always provisional. No empire, no matter how meticulously constructed, is immune to disruption when confronted with the combined forces of law, betrayal, and public attention. Ultimately, the trial and sentencing represented a turning point in Luciano's life. He faced a long prison term, a symbolic and practical blow to his empire. Yet, even in defeat, he demonstrated the qualities that had defined his rise: strategic thinking, composure, and the ability to influence outcomes from a distance. While physically confined, his mind remained active, plotting the preservation and adaptation of his organization. The courtroom had challenged his dominance, but it had not destroyed the vision, networks, or principles that had allowed him to build modern organized crime. The trial became a study in contrasts: power versus accountability, intelligence versus authority, perception versus reality. For Luciano, it was both a personal trial and a test of the resilience of the system he had created. Every witness, every document, and every cross-examination became part of a larger narrative about the nature of loyalty, the fragility of influence, and the consequences of ambition. By navigating this high-stakes environment with calculated poise, he demonstrated that the true measure of power is not only the ability to rise but also the ability to survive when the rules of the game change. In the end, the trial and sentence were not merely legal events, they were a crucible that exposed the vulnerabilities and strengths of a man who had mastered the underworld. It marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where survival depended less on immediate control and more on strategic foresight, manipulation, and adaptation. The fall from absolute dominance had begun, but the lessons of the courtroom would inform every subsequent move, every negotiation, and every maneuver in the years to come. The trial and the sentence would become the defining turning point, the moment when lucky Luciano faced the consequences of his ambition and learned that even the most meticulously built empire could be challenged, if not destroyed, by forces beyond his immediate control. Even behind bars, lucky Luciano's influence did not fade. Prison, rather than being a terminal blow to his power, became a new arena in which he continued to assert control and shape the underworld according to his vision. The authorities may have confined his body, but his mind, networks, and carefully cultivated alliances remained active. From the moment he was incarcerated, Luciano understood that leadership extended beyond proximity, that influence could be projected through strategy, communication, and loyal intermediaries. Prison became not just a punishment but another test of his ability to maintain authority, command respect, and manipulate the environment to his advantage. The first challenge was establishing dominance within the prison system itself. Unlike the streets, where fear and respect were earned through a combination of muscle and strategic alliances, prison required different methods. Luciano relied on reputation, intelligence, and psychological acuity. Guards, wardens, and fellow inmates all became variables to manage. He understood the power of perception, even subtle displays of control, such as calm composure, strategic conversation, or discreetly mediated conflicts, reinforced his position as a man not to be underestimated. Other prisoners, including seasoned criminals and potential rivals, quickly recognized that Luciano's influence extended beyond bars and that defiance came at a cost. Beyond personal dominance, Luciano focused on sustaining and expanding his external operations. Communication networks were established through trusted intermediaries, coded messages, and covert visits from loyal associates. Operations in gambling, labor racketeering, and organized crime continued under his oversight, albeit with careful management to avoid unnecessary exposure. Men who had once reported directly to him on the streets now coordinated with him in prison, respecting the hierarchy he had established. Through these channels, Luciano demonstrated that true power was not confined to physical presence, it was embedded in systems, loyalty, and the orchestration of influence. Prison also became a stage for diplomacy. Luciano negotiated with rival inmates, jail authorities, and even federal officials, using his understanding of human behavior to secure privileges and maintain autonomy. He mediated disputes, diffused potential conflicts, and ensured that his environment was manageable, all while projecting an image of calm authority. In this microcosm of society, his ability to balance intimidation with respect, reward with consequence, and strategic foresight with immediate action proved essential. It was a continuation of the same principles that had allowed him to consolidate power on the streets, now adapted to the constraints of incarceration. At the same time, Luciano began to engage with federal authorities in ways that would later reshape his life and the course of organized crime in America. During World War II, U.S. officials recognized his influence over docks, shipping, and labor unions, critical points for securing ports against sabotage and facilitating wartime logistics. Luciano leveraged this leverage to negotiate for improved conditions and reduced sentences, offering cooperation in exchange for practical assistance. It was a calculated gamble, a demonstration of his capacity to turn adversity into opportunity. Even imprisoned, Luciano understood the power of strategic alignment, diplomacy, and timing, lessons that had been honed over decades of navigating a treacherous underworld. The concept of loyalty remained central to his continued influence. Luciano maintained relationships with soldiers, lieutenants, and external allies, ensuring that obedience and respect were preserved. Men who might have considered defection were reminded of the consequences, both through subtle pressure and occasional targeted enforcement. Simultaneously, he rewarded initiative, competence, and loyalty, creating a dual system of fear and respect that maintained cohesion even without his physical presence on the streets. His genius lay in managing human psychology. Even absent, Luciano shaped behavior, incentivized loyalty, and orchestrated operations that would sustain his empire. Prison also offered him an opportunity for reflection and planning. Confined physically but not mentally, Luciano analyzed the successes and vulnerabilities of his empire, identifying areas for reform and consolidation upon his eventual release. He considered succession, future alliances, and the preservation of his legacy. The constraints of incarceration forced him to rely entirely on intellect, foresight, and diplomacy, qualities he had long employed but now had to magnify in the absence of physical mobility or immediate enforcement power. Meanwhile, the outside world continued to recognize his authority. Even as prosecutors attempted to dismantle his operations, the networks he had meticulously constructed allowed for continuity. Men remained loyal, agreements were enforced, and strategic initiatives continued largely uninterrupted. This continuity underscored a revolutionary aspect of Luciano's leadership. He had institutionalized authority, making the organization resilient to personal setbacks, including imprisonment. The Mafia had become larger than any single individual, yet Luciano remained at its intellectual and strategic center. Within prison walls, Luciano also cultivated an image that balanced menace with respectability. He was feared enough to prevent challenges but charismatic enough to attract allies. His ability to navigate these social dynamics, even under constant surveillance, reflected a deeper understanding of power. Influence was as much about perception and psychology as it was about coercion or resources. He used conversation, observation, and subtle interventions to maintain equilibrium and reinforce his authority, ensuring that prison did not become a symbolic end to his career but rather a stage in its evolution. Luciano's interactions with federal authorities during this period also highlighted his ability to adapt strategy to circumstance. By providing assistance in wartime logistics and security, he demonstrated value beyond criminal operations, negotiating a measure of goodwill that would later aid his eventual release. He transformed potential vulnerability into leverage, a maneuver that reinforced both his tactical acumen and understanding of systemic power. Through careful negotiation, he blurred the lines between criminal influence and pragmatic cooperation, ensuring that he remained relevant and influential even while incarcerated. The experience of power behind bars reinforced key lessons about leadership, loyalty, and strategy. Luciano's empire functioned not because of his physical presence but because of the systems, alliances, and human behaviors he had cultivated over decades. The commission, the hierarchy, and the operational protocols were resilient structures that allowed continuity despite adversity. Prison, far from diminishing his authority, became a proving ground for his vision. Power could be maintained, even expanded, through intellect, psychology, and a careful orchestration of networks. By the time he emerged from prison, Luciano's influence had been preserved, though reshaped by the realities of incarceration. He had demonstrated that true leadership extends beyond presence, fear, or immediate control. It resides in strategy, foresight, and the ability to influence human behavior across time and distance. His authority, carefully managed and sustained behind bars, ensured that the empire he had built would continue to thrive, demonstrating that the mind, even when confined, could exert power far greater than brute force. Power behind bars was thus a testament to Luciano's genius. He had turned imprisonment into a laboratory for leadership, a crucible that tested and confirmed his ability to maintain control under constraint. Through careful management, psychological insight, and strategic negotiation, he ensured that his empire remained intact, his authority unchallenged, and his legacy secure. Even in confinement, lucky Luciano proved that leadership is not merely about presence or fear, it is about vision, resilience, and the capacity to orchestrate human ambition from any position, no matter how restricted. After his release from prison, lucky Luciano faced the profound reality of exile. In 1946, he was deported to Italy, leaving behind the streets of New York and the empire he had built with meticulous care. The familiar neighborhoods, allies, and criminal networks he had nurtured for decades were now separated by an ocean, replaced by the unfamiliar streets of Naples and Rome. For a man who had thrived on control and proximity, exile was both a punishment and a test of resilience. Yet Luciano's intellect and strategic acumen had never been limited by geography. He understood that true influence was not merely physical, it could be projected, orchestrated, and preserved through careful management and loyal intermediaries. Italy in the post-war period was a nation in turmoil, with fractured institutions, poverty, and a resurgence of organized crime. Luciano navigated this environment with characteristic subtlety, leveraging his reputation to forge alliances with local mafia figures and establish influence without provoking open conflict. His approach was strategic, combining diplomacy with a reputation for authority. Unlike the streets of New York, where dominance could be imposed through fear or decisive action, Italy demanded patience, negotiation, and respect for local hierarchies. Through careful observation and calculated intervention, Luciano ensured that he remained a respected figure, capable of shaping criminal operations from a distance. Despite the physical distance, Luciano maintained oversight of his American operations. Trusted lieutenants and intermediaries relayed information, executed directives, and ensured the continuity of gambling, labor racketeering, and smuggling networks. The systems he had created in New York functioned independently, yet remained responsive to his strategic vision. Exile revealed a critical truth about his genius: he had institutionalized authority in such a way that the empire could endure without his immediate presence. Power, he demonstrated, resides as much in structure and loyalty as it does in personal command. Exile also brought a period of reflection. Removed from daily street operations, Luciano assessed his life, his empire, and the long-term implications of his actions. He contemplated succession, alliances, and the sustainability of his networks. He recognized the impermanence of personal control and the importance of creating systems resilient to time, legal pressures, and human betrayal. Philosophically, exile became both a challenge and an opportunity, a crucible that tested his adaptability and confirmed that influence could endure even in the most constrained circumstances. In these final years, Luciano's legacy crystallized. He had survived imprisonment, public scrutiny, and exile, transforming every setback into strategic advantage. Even in a foreign land, his authority, vision, and intellect continued to shape the underworld, illustrating the enduring power of strategy, foresight, and human insight. Exile, rather than diminishing his significance, underscored the resilience of his empire and the brilliance of the man who had built it. Lucky Luciano's influence reshaped the very architecture of organized crime, transforming it from chaotic street-level gangs into a disciplined, corporate-like enterprise. His genius lay not only in personal ambition but in his ability to institutionalize power. Through the creation of the Commission, Luciano introduced governance, mediation, and accountability to a world previously dominated by impulsive violence and fragmented loyalties. This system allowed rival families to operate in coordinated harmony, reducing turf wars and creating a foundation for long-term expansion. His methods were meticulous, alliances were forged with precision, loyalty was incentivized, and operations were structured for efficiency and continuity. Luciano's vision extended beyond immediate gain. he understood the psychology of power. Fear, respect, and opportunity were leveraged to ensure loyalty, while betrayal carried strategic consequences. By institutionalizing these dynamics, he created a model for influence that was resilient to law enforcement pressure, internal conflict, and generational change. His innovations in gambling, labor racketeering, and organized smuggling demonstrated that criminal enterprises could be treated like complex, strategic businesses. Even decades after his death, the principles he established, strategic alliances, organizational oversight, and systemic discipline, continue to inform the operations of criminal networks worldwide. His global impact was equally profound. The methods and organizational frameworks he pioneered in New York influenced organized crime in Chicago, Miami, Havana, and Europe. Beyond criminal operations, Luciano's life shaped law enforcement strategies, prompting new investigative methods, surveillance techniques, and anti-racketeering legislation. Ultimately, his legacy is both cautionary and instructive, a study in ambition, intellect, and human behavior, showing how one man's vision can endure far beyond his own presence, leaving an indelible mark on history. Lucky Luciano's life is a study in contrasts, power and vulnerability, brilliance and ruthlessness, myth and reality. From his rise on the streets of New York to his orchestration of the modern Mafia, his story demonstrates the transformative power of intellect, strategy, and psychological insight. Even in moments of defeat, imprisonment, exile, and public scrutiny, Luciano adapted, demonstrating that influence depends not solely on force, but on vision, foresight, and the orchestration of human behavior. The public myth of Luciano as an untouchable don often overshadows the man himself. Yet the reality reveals a complex figure, a strategist who understood the interplay of loyalty, fear, and opportunity, a leader capable of both calculated violence and long-term planning, a visionary whose systems outlasted his personal presence. His innovations in governance, operational efficiency, and strategic diplomacy set new standards for criminal enterprises, creating an enduring blueprint that has influenced generations of leaders worldwide. Luciano's life also provides insight into the impermanence of power. Empires, no matter how meticulously constructed, are vulnerable to law, betrayal, and circumstance. Yet through his intellect and strategic genius, he demonstrated that leadership can be preserved even when direct control is lost. His exile, far from ending his influence, became a stage for reflection, adaptation, and sustained authority. In the end, Lucky Luciano's story is more than a tale of crime, it is a meditation on human ambition, the dynamics of power, and the enduring capacity of strategy to shape systems and people. His legacy endures as a testament to the art of influence, a man who, through vision, intellect, and resilience, transformed the underworld into a lasting empire and whose imprint continues to echo across history and culture.